Um, yeah, my name's Keith Warburton, and I specialise in this field of the impact that international cultural differences can have when people work in a cross-border environment. And I've been working in this field for the last 20 years, really. Uh, Prior to that, and what kind of led me into this field was I used to work for a large American consultancy business. We were multidisciplinary. My area of expertise was kind of company restructuring, re-engineering, which is a polite way of saying that I was Mr. Axe for many years, but I've changed. I'm a nice guy now. And during that period where I worked for that American consultancy, I was almost exclusively an expatriate outside the UK, where I'm from originally. I worked in 9 different countries, a number of different European countries, then in the Middle East, in Egypt and Dubai. And then I spent just under 10 years working out in Asia, in Japan, Hong Kong and Korea. So I lived and worked in lots of different business cultures. I ran businesses in those countries. And what led me to look into this field of the impact that international cultural differences can have was our client base was mainly large multinational Americans, and we would run big global change programs for them, basically. And I would find myself, for example, working in the subsidiary of American corporation in Seoul in Korea. And we would be trying to apply policies and processes into that subsidiary in Korea when those policies and processes had actually been developed in Wisconsin in the States. And you found that they really didn't fit in the environment you were working in. And there would be a lot of reasons why they didn't fit, not all of which were cultural, but many of which were strongly cultural. And I would get back in touch with the client, get back in touch with my colleagues in the States and say, look, I can see why you want to do this, guys, great idea, but it won't work in its current format in this environment because of the following reasons. And the answer to that comment from the States was invariably, well, if you can't make it work, Keith, we'll just have to find somebody else who can. And it was always kind of the individual who was blamed rather than factoring all of this stuff in more holistically. And that's what led me to look into this field. And we work all over the world now, whole range of different clients and lots of different sectors. But it's all focused around this issue of how can you get businesses to work more effectively cross-border, across the barriers of culture, language, geography, time zones, technology, all of that kind of issue. And what I'm going to focus on today is a fractal of what we do. And it's this issue about leading global virtual teams in this hybrid environment which we find ourselves in. And the way I'm going to run this is as follows. Obviously, we're just going through the introduction, but I'm just going to set out a little scenario of the type of situation we're debating here, we're discussing. And then I'm going to talk about what some of the challenges are that are faced in that scenario. And then I'll just talk a little bit in a bit more depth about some of the key issues that I think you need to be thinking about in order for these cross-border virtual teams to work together effectively. And I'll wrap it all up at the end about some key takeaways that you can think about. So that's what we're going to cover during this session. I'm going to speak for probably about 25 minutes, half an hour maximum, and we will take some questions at the end. But as Matt said, what I'd really like is if you could, as any questions occur to you as I'm talking, if you could stick those questions in the chat function, which you can see, you all know where it is. Anyway, if you scroll at the bottom, you'll find it. Just type in any questions you've got there, and then Matt will interrupt me at various points and throw those questions at me. Great. Okay, so what are we looking at here? Well, we're basically looking at a situation where you've got a team leader from one particular country. It could be the UK, it could be the States, could be anywhere. And they're working with a team who are based in different countries. So they're working virtually because they're not in the same location, and they're working with people who have different cultural backgrounds. Now, you could change that diagram there and put team leader in the middle. If you're in the UK, instead of India, you could put Manchester, and instead of Germany, you could put Birmingham, and instead of Saudi Arabia, you could put Cardiff, because you have virtual teams within one country. And, you know, it is more complex to make a virtual team work effectively in one single country than it is to make a co-located team work. But when you add on top of that the layer of cultural difference that you find when this is a global thing, then obviously the challenges are exponentially greater. And what are some of those challenges? Well, in that particular scenario that I just outlined there, first of all, is you've got 8 different nationalities. You've probably got 7 different time zones, possibly more. I didn't actually total it up. It could be more. And therefore, because you've got 8 different nationalities, you've got 8 different cultural approaches to business. And one example of that would be you've got potentially 8 different views on what good leadership looks like. From my perspective, as a kind of globalist, there is no such thing as good leadership. There is just good leadership in a certain geographic and cultural environment. We do a massive amount of work on outsourcing projects to India, for example. And what is good leadership in the UK would be classified as poor leadership in India. And what is good leadership in India is classified as poor leadership in the UK. So when you've got teams of cross-border people working together, they've got a leader, and that leader will have a leadership style which is probably dictated by his cultural background. And that's a challenge for everybody else in the team. And then within the team, you might have people from cultures which are massively hierarchical. And you might also in the same team have people from cultures who are not at all hierarchical, who have a much more egalitarian approach to the way in which they think things should be done. Very often in these global teams, we find that people are not particularly globally experienced. They've never worked outside their own country. And so they have some international exposure, but it's not particularly deep. And most people in the team are also therefore using what is for them a foreign language, because most of the work is done in English. But obviously, if you're German or Brazilian or whatever, you're working in a second language. So those are the types of challenges which are presented in this virtual team environment. And in our experience, people just put these teams together and don't give people any assistance in helping them to make that team work effectively. I've come across a number of instances where somebody is pulled into a room and said, well, you've been doing a good job leading this team in London for the last 3 years. So from next Monday, you've got a global role now, and you've got 8 different nationalities who will be reporting to you. Good luck. And that's it. That's the guidance that they're given. And I think that's a bit sloppy, really. So what are some of the things that people really need to be focusing on in order to make these global virtual teams work more effectively? So I'll start at the basis, which is the fact that these teams are riddled with culturally differing approaches to what looks good, how things should be done. And so the basis of what we talk about in the work that we do on cultural differences is that depending on where people are born, where they're raised, that the influences or the programming, as we call it, that people go through tends to differ significantly from country to country. So the way in which your parents interact with you, the way in which your schooling is delivered, the structure of your university education, if you go to university, and really critically for me, your early days in the working environment, where all of your working patterns and habits tend to get formed for the rest of your career, those really strong influences that everybody goes through differ radically from country to country. And that is just a fact. And the result, we believe, of all of this difference in programming that people go through variously in different countries around the world is that you have developed what you could call sets of national characteristics, and that each country will develop its own slightly unique approach to business. So I don't have time to go into much detail about this programming, but I'll just give you one really quick example of what I mean by this programming, how it can trickle through and impact on day-to-day relationships in business. So what I'll do is I'll give you a communication-based example, and I'll give you a communication-based example because when we work with clients, people tell us that cross-border communication, effective cross-border communication, is a real challenge. And I think when people say that, very often they assume the challenges they face communicating cross-border are the direct result of the fact that we all speak different languages. And that is an issue, and I don't deny that, but it is only part of the issue. The issue is much deeper than that. It's not just that we speak different languages, it's very much related to the fact that we use language differently. What is considered to be good communication style in one country will very often be considered to be very poor communication style in another country. So, for example, when I'm working with a group of business people in the UK, I say to them, if you've got a child in the UK that talks all the time, talk, what do we say to that child? And the group kind of more or less to a man or a woman and instantly say, well, we'll tell it to be quiet, to shut up. And this is actually true because this has been researched. And apparently the British tell their children to shut up relatively quickly in global terms. Now, and you say, well, why do we do that? Don't we like children? And people then say things like, well, silence is golden, children should be seen and not heard. But eventually they have a little debate and they kind of come to the conclusion that in the UK, there is a right and a wrong amount to talk. People who talk too much, from our perspective, we have thoughts about them and we have words that we would use to describe them, and they're not very positive words. And therefore, what we do in the UK is we will program our children to use language in a way which is most effective in the UK environment, which is exactly the right thing to do. What about if you've got a child in Spain or Italy or Greece that talks like, what's the reaction there? Well, it's less likely to be discouragement and much more likely to be an active encouragement, because in those countries to use a larger volume of language would be considered to be a sign of intelligence, good education, good family background. And I think that the ability to use a larger volume of language in countries like that would be one of the key management tools that you'll need later in life to help you control people and processes. And Italian or Spanish parents would therefore quite rightly program their children to use language in a way which is appropriate in those countries. And that's fine when the British are talking to the British or the Italians are talking to the Italians. The problems start when people meet in a meeting. What do people in countries like the UK, the Netherlands, Germany, what do people tend to say about Southern Europeans and the amount of talking they do? Well, they say they talk too much, but they don't talk too much. They just talk more than we do. And obviously, the way in which you use language, your communication style, is going to impact directly on meetings, telephone conferences, written materials, negotiations, presentations, all of those core activities that people are involved in when they work cross-border in a global virtual team. Now, there are lots of examples of that program that I could give you. I could give you hundreds of examples, and I don't have time to do that today. But what we believe is, as I've said, is that the result of that programming is that you have developed what you could call sets of national characteristics, and each country will develop its own slightly unique approach to business. We have compared and contrasted all kinds of different business cultures all over the world. That's kind of what we do. And whenever you compare two different countries' approach to business, you will always find that there is a degree of similarity in the way in which they do things and a degree of difference in the way in which they do things. You will never find two countries whose approach is identical, nor two countries where the approach is completely different. There's always that degree of similarity and difference. And therefore, our contention would be that if you're working with people from a certain part of the world, might it not be a good idea to find out where are your similarities in approach and where are your differences in approach? Because the similarities will be the points where you can build bridges and form better relationships. But the differences equally, or actually from my perspective, more importantly, the differences are where the potential challenges will be found. And if you could isolate those areas of challenge in advance, well, at least if they happen, you won't be too surprised. But at best, and this is what this is all about, at best, you can work out some solutions which will prevent things from becoming problems in the first place. When cultural challenges happen within global virtual teams, which they do all the time, we come across them every day in the work we do, I don't believe that those problems ever, or very rarely anyway, happen because people are deliberately trying to cause problems. On the whole, everybody's got goodwill and wants to do a good job. On the whole, it happens through a lack of knowledge and a lack of understanding. And anything we can do individually or organizationally to improve knowledge areas, knowledge levels in this area will help to reduce, I don't know if you could eliminate, but help to reduce the potentially negative impacts that cultural differences can bring to a virtual team. And more importantly, help to gather together what should be the benefits of having a truly diverse team with really diverse thought patterns and all of the strength that that can bring to an organization. Now, one of the direct results of all of this programming is that everybody ends up wearing what I call a pair of cultural spectacles. And if you are British, like I am, then the lenses in your spectacles are made in the UK. And that colours the way in which I view the world, the way in which I react and respond to everybody and everything. But what I need to bear in mind every time I'm dealing with a colleague, a client, or another stakeholder in a different country, I have to be aware that they are also wearing a pair of cultural spectacles. But the lenses in their spectacles were manufactured somewhere else. And that will therefore give them a somewhat, or sometimes a completely different worldview. Their whole appraisal criteria are about what constitutes, for example, a good professional approach from a leader might be completely different than I'm used to in my own country. And that simple fact accounts for the fact that quite often when you work with people in different cultures, in different countries, you do something in a way that you know if you did it that way in your own country, it will be well received. But you do it exactly the same way with people from somewhere, from another country, and it seems to go quite badly. And you can't really work out why. But that's because you're being judged through a differing, and from my perspective, crucially, a largely unknown set of appraisal criteria. You have to accept when you work cross-border, when you're working with other team members in a virtual team, you have to accept that you do not see yourselves as other people see you. I think that's true everywhere. I think that's true in your own country, that you don't see yourself as people see you, but it's magnified so many times when you push it through what I consider to be the magnificent distorting lenses of cultural difference. We don't see ourselves as other people see us, and therefore there is a real need to develop very high levels of objectivity when we're working cross-border. We need to be less subjective in our approach and more objective. What I'm really saying there is that you need the ability to take off your cultural spectacles. And it's really easy for me to say that you should take off your cultural spectacles. But in reality, it can be a very difficult thing to do. And I know it's a difficult thing to do because I look at myself. I'm, as I say, worked outside the UK, 9 countries, 20 years, speak a number of different languages. And this is what I do as a living. But having said that, I am so British, it's unbelievable. When things get difficult, my default position is always the UK approach. And I think that points to a challenge of the impact cultural difference, which is that cultural differences you tend to find are not really a challenge. They become a challenge when things get difficult. And that's when you really need to keep this stuff right at the front of your mind. But it's obviously when it's most difficult to do that because there's so many other things happening. And one of the challenges of cultural difference and the vastness of the world and the vastness of the differences in different cultures is that you just don't know what you don't know. And every time you make a decision and you drop a pebble into a pond, the ripples go out to places you might not even know exist. And then they start bouncing back at you. And then you're into the territory of the impact of unforeseen consequences. And you really have to try and build in this global mindset to all of your actions when you're working cross-border. So I have this little trite phrase, which is a globalization. It's a mindset, not a word. and we have to get ourselves into that mindset. So these global virtual teams are kind of riddled with a whole host of cross-cultural differences and complications which need to be managed and if the team is to work effectively. And one of the biggest areas which is challenging there, as I said before, is cross-border communication. And in these virtual teams, cross-border communication is difficult at two different levels. First of all, there's this whole area of communication styles. What is considered to be good communication style in one country is poor communication style in another country. And you know, I'm British, and there's a lot of British people on this call. And one of the workshops we run a lot for the subsidiaries of our British clients overseas is we run a workshop which is called Working with the British. And we're always being told the challenges that people have working with the Brits. And the biggest complaint, I suppose complaint is probably the right word, that I get from people internationally about working with the British is about what is considered to be our appallingly poor communication style. You get comments along the lines of, the problem with working with the British is that you ask them a question and they answer you for half an hour, at the end of which you've got to say, look, I'm really sorry, but are you saying yes or are you saying no? Somewhere in the fog of that answer, there might be an answer, but I can't see what it is. And if you're a British leader of a global virtual team and your communication is surrounded by fog, as it very often is, that makes it very challenging for all of your team members. And those communication style differences are then compounded by the fact that many team members are using what is for them a foreign language. So they're using a second language. And again, this is a real challenge. If you're British or American, I think we have the somewhat fallacious view that being native speakers of the English language gives us a tremendous advantage. I honestly, I start from the opposite viewpoint. I think having English as your native language in a global context can be a distinct disadvantage. Very often a German guy will say to me, look, Keith, if I'm doing business in English, I find it so much easier to do business in English with a Danish guy or a Dutch guy than I do with a Brit or an American. And that's because as native speakers of the language, we use the language in such a complex way that it can be challenging for non-native speakers to follow us. And I very often have quite deep discussions about this with my clients. And I've got this somewhat contentious argument, which is I say to clients, don't waste money teaching your employees foreign languages until you have ensured that they are all proficient at speaking English internationally in a way that non-native speakers can understand. Because if you spend a lot of money on teaching them German, well, that's fine. They can use that in Germany and Austria and Switzerland. But what about when they're dealing with people in Italy or in Japan? That's not going to help them at all. But if you can teach yourself to speak English in a user-friendly fashion globally, then you can use that everywhere. And it's a real skill to do that. I always say that I speak a number of foreign languages, one of which is English as a foreign language. And that's my most useful commodity, I think. So communication is problematic. And then there's the whole issue of the fact that people are working in a virtual environment, and you have to build cross-border cohesion. And there are challenges in that because every team member will have different culturally driven views on how meetings should be run. There's no such thing as a good meeting. There's just a good meeting in a certain location. What should the decision-making process be? You look at, for example, you say, well, what country A is hierarchically structured and so is country B, and therefore decisions will be made at the top of the hierarchy. But if country B is Japan, decisions are not made at the top of the hierarchy, they're made in the middle of the hierarchy. So, there's a whole plethora of different decision-making processes which are current in different cultures. And you could have team members who have different views on what decisions the decision-making process should be. People have different views on what they expect from their leader and their manager, what should be escalated, and just how present people should be. Can we realistically expect people to be available for a Zoom call at 10 o'clock at night? Or, is that illegal in that country and we can't expect that? So there's a whole host of different dynamics going on with this environment. And then you've got to ask yourself the question, God, that's really complex, Keith. How do we get over that problem? How do we get cohesion from the chaos that could potentially be there? And I think it needs structure, and structure is the answer to these things. That one thing that I think doesn't work is if we say, well, we've got a corporate culture, and the corporate culture says, this is the decision-making process, this is how meetings are run, etc., and you impose that on people around the world. And my experience says that people balk at that. People really push back on that. I do a lot of work with the subsidiaries of global companies, and you get a lot of comments around all the ideas that come out of our head office. They may be fine over there, but they'll never work in our country. And people just push back very often when things are imposed from the centre. And so it's got to be a hearts and minds issue. You've got to take people with you in this whole process. And I liken getting people to work together as a global virtual team. I liken it to a project. And in any project, you've got to strive towards mutually agreed approaches. And in any project, the first thing you do is you sit down together and you say, where are we? What's our current position? And then you say, okay, what we're trying to achieve here, what's the goal? That can be more difficult, but you agree on that. And then the third thing you say is, okay, we need a process or a methodology to take us from where we are to where we want to get to. Now, in a global virtual team scenario, what this relates to is, where are we? What's our current effectiveness as a global virtual team? The goal is, what would be the ideal in the way in which we operate together? And there's a gap between the two. There's a gap analysis to be done between the two. And then when you've got that gap analysis, you need to agree amongst the team ways of working together. We call this, and it's a document that we put together with clients. We call it a team operating agreement. Other people call it a team protocol. You can call it Brian. I don't know. I don't care what you call it. But it delineates the way in which the team will operate together. And it talks about things like how meetings will be run, what the decision-making process will be, what needs escalating when, what different technologies we use for different communication scenarios, roles and responsibilities within the team. All of this stuff is agreed between the team. And all of the research that you can look at on global virtual teams will tell you that those global virtual teams that have a team operating agreement in place are more effective than those that do not. And I stake my career on it that these are a good idea. And if they are a good idea, then the question I ask is, whose responsibility is it to make it happen? And I think it's the team leaders, it's the global virtual team leaders' responsibility to make sure that team operating agreement is in place. It's not his responsibility to impose it without discussion, but it is his responsibility to make sure it's in place. And personally, I think that's the key responsibility of a global virtual team leader, because as that team leader, you're challenged to bring in that project, for example, on time and on budget. And the way you'll do that is by having a fully functioning, effective team in the middle. And this is one of the things that will help you to do that. So as organizations move forward on this, how do you make progress on this? Well, I think people need, first of all, everybody needs awareness that these challenges are there, that they're culturally driven and they're driven by the fact that we're working virtually. And when they're aware of that, it's kind of almost an intellectual activity to make yourself aware of that. And when you are aware of that, what you need then is knowledge, because, okay, you know that you've got people within your team or teammates who have different cultural approaches and views, but what are those different cultural views? and approaches, and you need knowledge around that. And when you've got that awareness and you've got that knowledge, you need to use that awareness and knowledge and practically apply it to the way in which your business and your teams operate on a day-to-day basis. And that's kind of the team operating agreement agenda that I use there. But you have, in my experience, you have to take people through this journey. You have to get them to intellectually buy into it. And when they do, I think it's a kind of light bulb moment that they recognize that there are things that can be done here, that you can put structures in place and you can improve people's knowledge of this. So what I've done there is kind of truncated what we cover in a 1 or 2 day program, very often when we used to do live programs, into a 30-minute session. And so I am very aware that I have scratched the tip of what is an enormous iceberg.